It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning. I'm David First, filling in for Brian today. Last night, the Rent Guidelines Board voted 7-1 to freeze rents on the city's roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments for the next 2 years. That's a first in the board's history, and it delivers on a signature promise of Mayor Mamdani's campaign. But a landlord member quit the board hours before the vote. The real estate industry is furious, and a legal challenge may be coming. Here to walk us through what just happened and what comes next is David Brand, who covers housing for Gothamist and WNYC. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And just to give us a little flavor here's a little bit of what it sounded like last night. And in case you can't make that out, that is freeze the rent. So, David, what exactly did the board decide last night?
Well, they decided to freeze the rent, just as the tenants who were in attendance yesterday were chanting about, and as listeners are probably familiar with, that viral campaign slogan that really propelled Mayor Mamdani's campaign last year to freeze the rent, one of the pillars of his campaign. Well, Rent Guidelines Board delivered the first ever 2-year rent freeze.
What does this cover? What does it leave out?
Sure. So this covers about 1 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City. The rent-stabilized housing stock is a really diverse collection of apartment buildings. You have century-old apartment buildings with 100% rent-stabilized apartments. This because the rules apply to buildings with 6 or more units that were built before 1974. But there's also tens of thousands of apartments in newer buildings that received tax breaks from the state property tax abatement program or government subsidies in exchange for keeping rents affordable. Those units are also subject to the rent stabilization rules. So nearly 1 million apartments, about 2.3 million tenants living in it, about 40% of the city's housing stock. This is it's going to have a big impact.
When does it actually take effect?
It takes effect on leases starting October 1st of this year.
Okay, so put this in some bigger context. You've already made it very clear this is a big deal, but how does a 2-year freeze compare to what tenants saw under former mayors Bill de Blasio, Eric Adams?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've talked about it being a big deal, I guess, politically, because this was Mamdani's key campaign pledge, and the board he appointed fulfilled that pledge. It will have a big impact for tenants, especially lower-income tenants who are seeing their costs rise across the board, and now they say, well, I'll have at least some certainty, or at least I know that my rent's not going to increase for the next 2 years while everything else rises. Landlords say it has a big impact on them, too, especially in these 100% rent-stabilized buildings where they're complaining about already facing financial distress with their expenses rising and their operating costs going up, and they say they need higher rents to offset those. But to take a step back and compare it to Mayor Adams, Mamdani's predecessor, under Adams, the board raised rents by a combined 12% over 4 years. Last year, it was a 3% increase. Under de Blasio, it was a much lower combined increase, and de Blasio actually presided over 3 rent freezes, though those are on 1-year leases.
Okay. And listeners, if you'd like to join this conversation, give us a call. 212-433-9692. Do you live in a rent-stabilized apartment? What does a 2-year freeze mean for you? And if you're a landlord, we want to hear from you as well. What does this decision cost you? Call us or text us at 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. And how much of a victory lap should Mamdani be taking here? How significant a victory is this? Coming in a week when all of his endorsed candidates won their primary elections.
He's kind of on a generational run this week. It seems like, he had the sweep of the congressional candidates, and a lot of socialist candidates for state office who are allies of his also won. And then 2 days later, he presides over this rent freeze that he guaranteed on the campaign trail. So it is a political victory.
As you've been talking about, he ran on this promise to freeze the rent, but the mayor doesn't actually set these rates. How much control does he actually have here? He did appoint, what, 6 of the 9 members? So that reshaped the board.
Right, and that's kind of the question here. How much influence does the mayor actually have over this board? And this isn't the first time this conversation has come up. Under Mayor Adams, people were questioning how much influence Adams and top city officials were exerting over the board. Same thing under de Blasio. So Mamdani, though he did pledge this rent freeze, the mayor themselves don't have the power to enact that. They preside over this board. As you said, he appointed 6 of the 9 members. He actually appointed 5 new members and reappointed a tenant representative who was first appointed under Mayor Adams. So he named 6 of the members, so he had influence in that way. But since taking office, he really stepped back from that call for a rent freeze and instead said, this is an independent board. They're going to be looking at the data, hearing testimony from tenants, landlords, other interested members of the public, and make the decision on their own. And that's strategic because he could face a lawsuit, or the board could face a lawsuit challenging undue influence from the Mamdani administration or Mamdani himself if he were to continue calling for a rent freeze, I think, as mayor.
Okay, if you want to join the discussion, 212-433-9692. And let's hear from Chris in Woodside. Chris, welcome to the Brian Lehrer Show. Are you a property manager?
That's correct, David. Thank you for taking my call. So I just want to go into a couple of quick things. This is the 10th year now in a row in which the research that the Rent Guidelines Board did in terms of how much costs have gone up for buildings, that the allowable rent increase is less than that. This is a very unsustainable trend for obvious reasons, because you can't really conduct a business if you're only allowed to raise your income less than your increase in expenses. I also want to say that what this ultimately also does is, by suppressing existing rents, it forces us managers to rent out vacant apartments at much more exorbitant rents than really they're valued at, which is one of the reasons why you've been seeing an acceleration in the affordability crisis. Vacant rents are going up because we have to offset the suppressed rents of existing tenants. And ultimately, I mean, this was absolutely no surprise to me because, again, with the DSA, they laid it out in their platform back, I think it was like 2019 or actually it was after, it was probably 2021, in which the old platform had stated specifically, we seek to counter the dangers faced by the building industry. We can do this by canceling rent, closing eviction courts, and as landlords exit the market, using state action to acquire private property and transform into public democratically controlled housing, whatever that means. Well, so, it's just a frustrating situation to be in when it's, you can take a pen. Clearly, this is where the mayor has the power, where they can take a pen. They can do something that has absolutely no cost to them, because by keeping the rents low and by doing a rent freeze, the city isn't paying for this. It's all coming out of it's all coming out of the pockets of the building owners and managers.
Okay, Chris, thank you so much for bringing up your side of this and your perspective. And Liam, what about some of those issues that Chris brings up?
Well, what he said there, if this covers 40% of the housing stock, what happens with the market rate apartments that make up the other 60% of the housing stock? Does that mean landlords are going to have to raise rents there to offset if they own buildings that have a mix of rent stabilized and market rate, or they have buildings with all rent stabilized and other buildings that are market rate? Do they then raise those? That's one of the criticisms of rent regulations, especially when it only applies to a portion of the market, that you see rents rise in the other portion. And that's definitely a common criticism. I don't know, the DSA platform that he mentioned about taking ownership, there has been efforts by the Mamdani administration to steer buildings from negligent landlords or landlords who are in financial distress and haven't been taking care of their buildings to what they consider more responsible entities like nonprofits or other private developers, and then help them with subsidies and tax breaks. But it's still kind of early days in the Mamdani administration, so we're seeing how that works out.
I want to ask a question because we just heard from a property owner. Perhaps the most surprising moment last night was when the owner representative Maxim Nguyen read a long statement. And then we did have someone leave before the vote last night, but he then voted for the freeze, right? What was his argument?
Yeah, that was kind of an unexpected turn. So the board is comprised of 9 members. There's 2 landlord representatives, 2 tenant representatives, and then 5 what they call public members who ostensibly are neutral. And so, as you mentioned, one of the owner members quit abruptly yesterday, hours before the vote. That left one still on the board. And you played that tape at the beginning of how wild it gets in there and how raucous. And traditionally, once the owner members are speaking, they get drowned out by the tenants in attendance, people whistling, people screaming for a rent freeze. I was sitting in the first row. I could barely hear. So I think reflexively, people see the owner member talking and they start booing to drown him out. And then I was actually listening on my computer to the live stream because I could hear that better through headphones. And I was like, wait, he's not saying what you all think he's saying. He was saying that a rent freeze would actually be good for landlords because owners, especially of affordable housing, have said that rent collections are down. And so if you were to increase rent, that would lead to even fewer people paying the rent and would actually have kind of the inverse effect for landlords. And he also said that the problems are not going to be solved by raising the rent by a modest amount. These are systemic problems like property taxes, insurance rates that are out of control, and other expenses that you hear from a lot of tenant-sided people say shouldn't be borne by the tenants. These demand some type of government intervention or real systemic reforms. And so that was the argument he was making.
I want to get to some more calls in just a second, but you touched on it briefly. But what was the scene like last night? This happened at El Museo del Barrio in East Harlem. This sounds like it was a crowd that was ready to celebrate.
The crowd was definitely ready to celebrate. And I think that's what made it somewhat different than past years. It's always raucous. It's always noisy, kind of claustrophobic, people standing, holding signs, screaming, blowing whistles, chanting, singing. But outside of the vote this year, there was actually a quintet playing instruments, playing music, people singing. I think people were ready to celebrate because a lot of people expected this rent freeze would come. And that is exactly what happened. I mean, afterward, people were singing and cheering, and it was definitely a celebratory vibe.
If you'd like to join this discussion, the number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. We're speaking with David Brand about the results of last night's Rent Guidelines Board's vote, deciding to freeze rents for the next 2 years. So if you want to join the discussion, once again, the number 212-433-9692. And let's hear from Riddy in Brooklyn. Welcome.
Hi. I had a question. You know, obviously a lot of folks there's the dynamics here with Zohran in the administration and running on that campaign promise to freeze the rent. But this is also a process, you know, tenants were obviously coming to, organizing around for years, including in 2024, tenants asked Zohran to get arrested with them at the RGB final vote when, Eric Adams raised the rent. And so I'm kind of curious here about what you think the dynamics are between the administration, the Rent Guidelines Board, but also like the organized tenants groups. And if we would have gotten specifically this 2-year rent freeze without the tenant groups putting that demand, you know, it wasn't really part of last year, on the table for those 2-year leases. Thank you.
Well, I think I know Riddy, who is herself a tenant organizer. So I hear this sentiment. I think that people in the tenant organizing world want to point out that Mamdani is an effective messenger and championed the goals and demands of tenants and really put tenants at the heart of his campaign. But it was the tenant organizers and tenant movement that have been doing this work for many years that I guess laid the foundation for the rent freeze and probably for Mamdani to be mayor in the first place.
And I want to get to two calls back to back here. 212-433-9692. Let's hear from Libby in Flatbush. Welcome.
Hi, it's so great to be here.
Welcome. Do you have a question?
I just had a comment. I've lived in a rent-stabilized apartment since 2015, and it's really changed my life. I did not know that I was moving into a rent-stabilized apartment. I'm one of the very lucky New Yorkers who had that special surprise. But I'm a social worker, and I work in early childhood mental health. It is not a super well-paying career path, but it is the career path that I am passionate about. And I really believe that if I didn't have this rent-stabilized apartment, I wouldn't be able to do it. I wouldn't be able to give back to my community and give back to my city that I love so much. So I'm very happy about the rent freeze. And I just wanted to put that out there that lots of people benefit from this, and I hope it keeps on going.
Okay, Libby, thanks for your perspective. Now let's hear from Michael in Flatiron with a concern, right, Michael?
Yes, I am concerned. Good morning. You know, I live in a rent-stabilized apartment. I've been here for 35 years, but I am afraid that this will be unsustainable for the owner of my building. I want my building to be well-maintained. I've always felt lucky to live in a rent-stabilized apartment, and I just don't see, it doesn't seem really fair or sustainable. You know, the thing that no one's talking about is this is going to bring a lot of lawsuits. And with the current makeup of the Supreme Court, I don't want the whole program to be in jeopardy. This may be overreach that may hurt the entire program. I think it seems just a little misdirected. Not going to fix New York City's housing problems. And I'm worried about my own rent-stabilized apartment. I think it's overreach, and it may jeopardize the entire system.
Michael, thanks so much for calling in. Liam, Michael bringing up some interesting thoughts there.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear from Libby in Flatbush and Michael in Flatiron with kind of different perspectives there, but both rent-stabilized tenants. But so what Michael brought up about the multiple lawsuits that have been filed with this attempt to get it before the Supreme Court, individual landlords, landlord groups have tried challenging rent regulations generally, especially a set of laws that took effect in 2019 that limited many of the ways that owners could raise rents. So previously, a landlord could raise the rent on a rent-stabilized apartment 20% once it became vacant. That was called the vacancy bonus. They could also, and could still do this to extent, but do individual apartment improvements and major capital improvements either to a specific apartment or to the building, and then raise rents as a percentage of that work, though that has been capped as well in 2019. One of the reasons the law was changed was because a vacancy bonus, and then I should also say you could raise rents to a certain threshold and take apartments out of rent stabilization. So those two things paired together incentivized landlords to harass people or to drive people out of the apartments. And that is what kind of was the impetus for these stricter tenant protections. But at the same time, those tenant protections now make this Rent Guidelines Board vote even more important because it is now essentially the only realistic way that landlords can raise rents. And to Michael's point, I don't know the situation with his building. Maybe all of the units are rent stabilized, and so there's no other opportunity for a landlord who is facing their own rising expenses to raise revenue. Many buildings, though, have a mix, and so I think the first caller said that landlords might raise rents on the market rate apartment to offset the capped rent on the rent stabilized. So it's really hard to paint everything with a broad brush because it is such a diverse housing stock and so many different apartments fall under the rent stabilization rules.
And what about some of those building maintenance issues that Michael brought up, his concerns that things won't be repaired, won't be able to be dealt with?
Yeah, and so what you hear from a lot of landlords and their advocates is that already you could see city data that housing code violations have been surging in recent years. And if you cap income to fix problems that landlords would use to fix problems in the building, if they're already having a hard time doing that, it's only going to get even more challenging if they can't increase the amount of money they have available to make those. And so here from landlord groups is that we could probably expect to see even more problems in these buildings.
And we'll take another call in just a moment, but we're getting a lot of people asking if we could once again mention when this goes into effect.
Yes, it goes into effect on new leases starting October 1st of this year.
Okay. And let's take another call. Daniel in Brooklyn, welcome to the Brian Lair Show.
Yeah, well, hi. Am I on the air?
You certainly are. Do you have a question?
Oh, my God, I do. I want to say I'm disappointed that Brian, unfortunately, is not on the show.
I'm so
fan,
sorry.
You know what? This is
sorry,
Daniel. So be it.
Sorry, you got two Davids
I guess
instead.
I just wanted to say two things in regards to the callers that called in. I mean, one is to Michael, which is not to, sling any mud, but it's that kind of like wilting Democratic voter that keeps us stuck in the mud of where we've been at basically for my whole life. I mean, you can't just say, oh, well, I have what I have, and the best thing to do is kind of keep my head down and stay quiet and hope that they allow me to keep it. And the second thing I'd like to say in response to the building manager is he's right. But, he's coming to this from the perspective of property as an investment as opposed to people's shelter. I live in a rent-stabilized apartment as well. I've lived there for probably 15 or 16 years now. It is an incredible blessing. I would not be able to live in the neighborhood that I've lived in if it weren't the case. And my building is mixed. Many units have been reverted or converted to market rate. And my landlord has explicitly told me that he would change mine if he were legally able to. I like the guy, so I'm not going to say his name. But, that is his intention, is to turn every apartment over to market rate. He's deeply disappointed with the new laws that stand in his way of not being able to do that. Most landlords who own rent-stabilized buildings chose them as investments with the idea that they would at some point convert to market rate.
Okay, Daniel, thank you.
So it's
sorry. If you wanted to wrap up.
Something where we're worried about. Oh, sorry. What were you saying?
No, if you wanted to have a last comment, sure.
I guess I'm just saying that this isn't something where landlords, necessarily we need to feel so worried about their investments being at risk. They chose these investments with the idea that they would not necessarily be rent stabilized for the lifetime of the building. Now that they are, perhaps they made a bad investment. But the landlords have the money to repair the buildings. They're over-leveraged because they're speculating on other real estate.
Okay, Daniel, thanks for your comments. Liam?
Yeah, what he said is definitely true. A lot of owners, especially bigger companies, came in and purchased buildings with intent of taking them out of rent stabilization or using that vacancy bonus to increase rents and then eventually get to that threshold to take them out of rent stabilization. That is definitely true. One thing that made me think about, though, is there is an imbalance here that I think a lot of tenants would point out, that if a landlord is facing financial problems, their expenses are rising, they are having a hard time keeping up, they might have a hard time paying off their loans, and maybe they would lose their property eventually. But when a tenant has financial problems and can't pay their rent, they might lose their home and become homeless, and they might be evicted. They might enter shelter. And so there is that kind of imbalance when we talk about the financial problems.
And David, you get to call me Liam from now on because I called you Liam by mistake.
You're David first. I'm David second.
You're David Brandt. Let's make this absolutely clear. And it's great to have you here talking about this news today. And I want to hear from a landlord. We have a landlord on the line right now, Noah, calling from Wyoming. Are you on vacation?
Yes, I am.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you. I think there's been a pretty good summary of both sides of the issues here, although I will say that the adolescent petulance that was on display at the meeting last night is emblematic of the politics that we're seeing in America, and we're not getting rational solutions to the problems we face. As has been noted, the increases have never kept up with inflation. But the thing that I think is really, really critically important here to understand is that landlords can no longer renovate units that might have been occupied for 40, 50, or 60 years and be in terrible condition and expect any return. In fact, they'll lose money. So what you're going to see is, over time, any unit that becomes vacant that was stabilized will simply stay vacant. it will not be put back on the market. So ultimately, this price control thing is self-defeating. And since there's no means test, and in fact, there's no incentive for landlords to even pursue any, for instance, non-prime residency or illegal subletting, et cetera, this is just going to diminish the quality of the housing stock for decades to come, as we saw happening in the early 1970s.
Noah, thanks for your call. Liam?
Noah does...
Liam, David.
Noah does bring up a point that is become a kind of a major theme of the arguments against the current rent regulations, and that is what we had just talked about, the vacancy issue in apartments. And so if someone leaves an apartment where the rent is low and that apartment requires a significant amount of renovations and repairs, the landlord can't raise the rent very much to offset all of that work. And so some number of landlords are leaving those units vacant, and hear a lot of numbers thrown around just how many apartments there are like that. But I think it's kind of inconclusive how many there really are, but some significant number.
David, as we look ahead to potential lawsuits, if landlords do sue, first of all, what do you know about that? And could a freeze that just passed actually get undone?
I don't know. I mean, that's the big question. I've heard some rumors about lawsuits to come. I think it's clear there will be some type of lawsuit. There already are lawsuits, as we mentioned, that are designed to try to overturn rent regulation rules more generally. In New York, there's something called an Article 78 lawsuit, which someone could file when they think to challenge a government decision. That could be a months-long process. And, say the rent freeze is overturned, well, then what would happen, because there's no alternative order in effect. So it's not like, no, you can't freeze the rent. We're instead going to do this, but there is no other this. There's no other option on the table right now. So I think it's really inconclusive what's going to happen and what the legal argument will be.
But as of right now, what exactly happens in October?
In October, rents will stay the same. If you sign a new lease, you should be paying the same amount of money that you are now if you live in a rent-stabilized apartment.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there for now. We're going to be hearing much more on this, I'm sure, in the weeks and perhaps months to come. Our guest was David, David Brand, housing reporter for WNYC and Gothamist. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And coming up next, have you noticed a change in how your grapes, blueberries, and other fresh fruit tastes? Ellen Cushing from The Atlantic shares her reporting on the way produce is getting sweeter. Stay with us. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC.